Good evening, friends. Today we are going to spend an entire day in a place that is both the most down-to-earth and the noisiest of all, a medieval tavern. Imagine that you are an utterly ordinary traveler who has just finished a long day on the road and pushed open that creaking wooden door. What would the air smell like? What would the people inside be talking about? And what would that cup of ale set before you taste like? Now dim the lights, and with the sound of bells, let us step into tonight's story. It is not yet dawn. Around 4 in the morning, the world is a deep, inky blue-violet, and only a few of the brightest stars still cling stubbornly to the velvet night sky. You are standing in the middle of a muddy dirt road. Before you rises a sturdy, dependable two-story building. This is our destination tonight, the White Hart Inn. The ground floor of the building is built from rough gray-white stone, looking impregnable, carrying the steady calm of something weathered by years. A few small, deeply set windows are cut into the stone walls, less for letting in light than for defense. The second floor is timber-framed, with dark oak beams crossing one another to support a steep, thatched roof. The roof is as thick as a furry cap, and along its edges, long washed by rain, clusters of dark green moss have grown. Your first impression of the building is not welcome, but rather keep strangers at bay. That is perfectly normal in the Middle Ages. Travel was always full of uncertainty and danger. The first thing an inn had to provide was not comfort, but safety. A thick wooden pole juts out from the front of the inn, and from its end hangs a wooden signboard painted, in somewhat clumsy strokes, with the figure of a white stag. Its antlers are exaggeratedly forked, and its expression looks less sacred than mildly surprised. That is the inn sign, the White Hart, in an age when most people could not read. Such an image was the most direct form of advertisement. The stag is, well, painted with the unmistakable touch of an enthusiastic amateur. But it tells you clearly enough that this is a place where you can rest. You go around to the side of the building and see a spacious yard where several freight wagons, covered with oiled cloth, are parked like tame beasts, sleeping in the dark. Nearby is a row of low stables. You can smell hay horsehide, and manure mingling in the air, a little sharp, but unmistakably rural. And that, precisely, tells you what sort of place this is. It is an inn, not merely a tavern or an alehouse. Taverns mainly sold drink, especially wine to locals. Alehouses were usually small domestic operations, with the mistress of the house brewing and selling ale herself. But an inn was meant for long-distance travelers. It had to provide lodging, food, and most important of all, stabling. Without somewhere to put a traveler's horse, even the finest inn could not survive. You do not go through the front door. That heavy oak door, studded with broad iron straps and nails, is still firmly barred from within. Like a ghost, you slip quietly around to the back of the inn, where there is a small inconspicuous kitchen door left slightly ajar, with a thread of faint light showing through the crack. You push it open gently and slip inside sideways. Before stepping through that door, you might have imagined a place like the inn from The Lord of the Rings, warm and bustling. But historical reality was usually far plainer. Large, professional inns capable of receiving great groups of pilgrims like Chaucer's Tabard Inn in the Canterbury Tales were in fact rare. Many so-called inns were little more than ordinary private homes, whose owners rented out spare rooms or even floor space to passing travelers for extra money. So a purpose-built commercial inn of some size like the White Hart would already have counted as a luxury roadside stop in its day. You tiptoe into the kitchen. At once, a complicated odor wraps around you. Cold ashes, charred wood, and the remnants of some food from the night before. This is the heart of the inn, and also the first place in it to wait. The kitchen is small and dim. Its only light comes from the great brick hearth in the center of the room. A figure is kneeling there, blowing laboriously at a tiny clutch of glowing embers. Sparks crackle and flare, lighting her face by turns. She looks to be in her 50s with full cheeks, strong arms, and hair wrapped in a gray kerchief. She is the cook, perhaps a relative of the innkeeper, perhaps a hired servant. She succeeds, with a soft rush, a small tongue of flame, catches the dry wood, and quickly grows into a warm orange fire. The light drives the darkness from the corners and reveals the whole kitchen. The walls are blackened by years of smoke. Strings of onions and garlic hang there, along with bundles of dried herbs with names you cannot quite place. Iron pots and earthenware jars of all sizes hang crookedly from hooks. A huge black cauldron sits over the fire just kindled. The cook rises, brushes the ash from her knees, picks up a wooden stirring paddle longer than your arm, and begins to stir the great pot. As she does, a warm, humble aroma spreads outward. The smell of grains and root vegetables mingled together. In the pot is the famous staple of the Middle Ages, something we might call a pottage or gruel. It is made from oats, barley, and other grains, cooked slowly together with whatever vegetables are in season: turnips, parsnips, leeks, onions, cabbage. Each day the household adds new ingredients and more water, and the pot keeps simmering. So the bowl of gruel you eat today may very well contain broth from 3 or 5 days ago, perhaps even from more than a week earlier. That may sound like a challenge to modern ideas of hygiene, but in a world without refrigeration and with food always scarce, it was the most economical and least wasteful way to cook. A single, everlasting pot of pottage supplied the basic calories needed by travelers from every direction, day after day. Meat, by contrast, was a profound luxury for ordinary people. Meat was not something you bought with money because they simply did not have that much money. It depended on whether you were fortunate enough to own animals that could be slaughtered or had the right to hunt. So in this pot, at most, you might see a few bones boiled almost to dissolution, there only to give flavor. At that moment there comes a rustling sound from a crude straw pallet in the corner of the kitchen. A boy of about 10 sits up, still bleary with sleep. He may be the cook's son, or perhaps the inn's apprentice. Yawning, he picks up 2 wooden buckets and staggers out the back door toward the well to fetch water. In that age, child labor was the most ordinary thing in the world. Children began sharing the family's work from a very young age. The sky gradually lightens, shifting from deep blue to pale white, and with a groaning creak, the inn's main door is open, announcing the official start of the new day. The man who opens it is tall, middle-aged, and severe in expression. He is the innkeeper, but the person who truly keeps this inn running is his wife, Martha. Martha comes out of the kitchen carrying a tray of freshly baked, blackish rye bread. She looks to be in her 40s, with a steady gait and sharp eyes, the very image of a capable woman in command. In that age, women like Martha had a particular title, alwat. In the early and central Middle Ages, brewing and selling ale was a female-dominated trade, one that gave women a considerable income and a certain degree of social standing. Martha not only manages the traffic of people coming and going through the inn. More importantly, she has brewed every drop of ale sold here with her own hands. Outside, the innkeeper sets up a pole tipped with a fresh bunch of branches and props it beside the door. This is an ale stake, an old sign telling passers-by and the authorities alike, we have fresh ale here, come and taste it. Very soon, the first customers arrive. They are not travelers from afar, but several local craftsmen, a blacksmith, a mason, and a man who seems to be a mill worker. They still carry the morning chill on them. Once inside, they make straight for the hearth, rubbing their hands for warmth. They are here for a morning drink. For men who do heavy physical labor, a cup of ale rich in calories and nourishment is the best possible liquid breakfast. From behind the bar, Martha dips amber-colored liquid from a huge oak barrel with a long-handled ladle and pours it into several rough pottery cups. You notice that this ale looks cloudier and thicker than modern beer. That is because in its brewing, no hops have been used. Hops, as a natural preservative, only became common in England later. Ale without hops tastes sweeter, but it spoils quickly and turns sour easily. So it can only be produced and sold locally. This also explains why the alewife's trade was always so tightly bound to the community around her. One of the customers orders food. Martha brings out a steaming bowl of gruel from the kitchen. But the vessel she serves it in is distinctive. A thick, square-cut slab of dark bread, hollowed out a little in the center to hold the stew. This is the legendary trencher, in an age before plates were common. Hard, stale bread served as tableware. Once the soup was gone, the bread itself soaked with meat juices, and broth became another dish to eat. And if you could not finish it, the trencher was usually tossed to the dog at your feet. The blacksmith who ordered the meal makes an interesting gesture before lifting his spoon. First, he traces a cross over his chest, thanking God for the food, a standard Christian act. But immediately afterward, he knocks twice on the wooden table with his knuckle. This is an old custom for warding off evil and misfortune, rooted in pagan belief. People believed spirits lived in trees. This seamless blending of Christianity with older folk superstition was everywhere in medieval daily life. And yet, in many medieval literary works and satirical images, alewives are often portrayed as greedy and deceitful. They are shown watering down ale, cheating customers with false measures, even being treated as regulars of hell itself. Historical records, however, show something rather different. Independent, respected businesswomen who were important pillars of the local economy. Was this stark contrast the result of widespread social anxiety about female economic independence and the urge to stigmatize it? Or were there really that many dishonest traders? Martha, before your eyes, looks hard-working and upright. But who knows whether, in the unseen corners, she also faced the same temptations and accusation. By mid-morning, the clear clatter of hooves and the rumble of wagon wheels roll through the silence and break the inn's calm. A party appears on the road, coming straight toward the White Hart. These are not local casual visitors, but a small merchant caravan. At its head rides a well-dressed merchant on a fine tall horse, its saddle and bridle decorated with gleaming metal fitting. Behind him come several capable assistants, some on horseback, some on foot, escorting 2 wagons loaded to the brim. Their arrival instantly transforms the inn from a local community center into a small international trading station. In an age of poor transport, inns like the White Hart were the vital nodes that connected towns and kept the arteries of commerce open. The innkeeper, Thomas, immediately goes out with a smile plastered across his face and personally takes the merchant's horse. The assistants hurry the wagons into the yard and begin unloading goods. Martha comes out too and greets the merchant warmly. Clearly, they are regular customers. The merchants bring not only business, but news from far away. They come from cities dozens, even hundreds of miles distant, London perhaps, or even from France across the Channel. They talk of the king's new taxes, the scandal of some nobleman, fluctuations in wool prices, and wonders from distant places. For locals who may never in their lives have left their own village, these merchants are their only window onto the outside world. At such a moment, the inn becomes an information exchange. You notice an interesting detail. One of the caravan's men takes a clove of garlic from a small leather pouch hanging around his neck and holds it under his nose, drawing in a deep breath as though gathering strength from it. His companions take no notice. This is not because he believes garlic will drive away vampires. That legend became popular later. His behavior is actually based on what was then considered the most scientific medical theory available, miasma theory. Medieval physicians and ordinary people alike believed disease spread through foul air, or miasma unseen, evil-smelling poisonous vapors that entered the body and caused illness. Thus, the best way to resist disease was to purify the air around you with an even stronger smell. The rich wore pomanders filled with expensive spices. Commoners used pungent plants such as garlic, onion, and rosemary as portable air purifiers. To that man, sniffing garlic is a rational scientific act of self-protection, not fundamentally different in logic from our wearing masks today. The merchant's noisy arrival fills the inn with energy, but in the eyes of the church, such places are dens of corruption without qualification. Priests, in their sermons, constantly warn the faithful to keep away from them, because they are said to be full of drunkenness, gambling, and all manner of immoral dealings. The church sees the inn as a breeding ground for sin, one that corrodes the soul. But was the medieval inn really, as in Chaucer, a lively public space where all ranks of society mingled? Or was it, as the church described, a place of confusion, danger, and moral decline? Perhaps it was both. Like the White Hart before your eyes, it is both a hub of commercial exchange and a place that, after night falls, may reveal another face entirely. Historical truth is often hidden in just such complex, layered realities. Once the goods are settled, the merchant leader, a wool dealer named William, begins handling some local business. A gentleman dressed like a well-to-do squire comes over, clearly to settle an old debt with William. You expect to see the exchange of a money pouch or the writing of a ledger entry. Instead, what follows opens your eyes. William carefully removes from his leather document bag a square wooden stick about a foot long. The squire takes from inside his own coat another, somewhat shorter one. Both are made of real wood, each marked by natural grain patterns unique to itself. This is a widely used medieval accounting tool, the tally stick. In a society with extremely high illiteracy, this system is almost brilliant in its design. When a debt is created, the two parties cut notches into a single stick to represent the sum involved. A notch as wide as a palm stands for 1,000 pounds, one the width of a thumb, 100 pounds, one the width of a little finger, 20 pounds, one the width of a plump barley corn, a single pound. Smaller cuts represent shillings, and pence are marked with a mere slight stroke. Once the notches are made, the crucial step comes next. The stick is split lengthwise down the middle, but not evenly. One half is longer, one shorter. The longer half is called the stock, and it goes to the creditor, the lender. This is, according to the story, the etymological root of the modern financial term, stockhold. The shorter half is called the foil, and it goes to the debtor. Because the line of fracture created when the wood is split is wholly random and impossible to reproduce. Only the original two halves can fit perfectly back together. That creates a physical contract that is almost impossible to forge. If either party secretly cuts extra notches into his own half to alter the amount, the fraud will be instantly exposed when the two pieces are matched. Now the squire has repaid the debt. He and William fit their stock and foil together and confirm that all is correct. William nods, then tosses both halves of the tally stick into the blazing hearth. Contract fulfilled. Physical evidence destroyed. The transaction is concluded. You might think this is merely a primitive folk bookkeeping method, but its actual range of use was far broader than you imagine. In fact, it once served as the official fiscal system of the Kingdom of England. For nearly 700 years, from the 12th century to the early 19th, the English exchequer used tally sticks to record taxation. These official tallies could even circulate in the market as government-backed instruments of credit, making them, in a sense, one of the earliest forms of national debt. In 1834, Parliament decided this system was hopelessly outdated and ordered the destruction of the mountains of old tally sticks that had accumulated in the exchequer cellars over centuries. They made what seemed a very efficient choice. They threw the wooden sticks into the furnaces of the Palace of Westminster as fuel. The fire burned too fiercely, set the chimney and walls ablaze, and ultimately caused a catastrophic conflagration that reduced the great Palace of Westminster, the Houses of Parliament, to ruins. An act meant to advance modernization ended by destroying itself in the most primitive way possible. Now the noon sunlight struggles in through the high windows, casting bright shafts through the dusty air. The inn enters its noisiest hour of the day. Local farmers, craftsmen, foreign caravan hands, and several men and women who look like passing pilgrims crowd the common hall. The air is thick with the mingled smells of sweat, ale, wet wool, and food. Amid this din, social hierarchy appears at the table with complete clarity. Wealthy William the wool merchant and the local gentleman sit at a separate table, eating their meal. Martha serves them personally, a plump roasted chicken, crisp and glistening with fat, accompanied by soft white bread and a small jug of very dark-looking wine. At the other end of the hall, the ordinary laborers and assistants sit shoulder to shoulder at long trestle tables, spooning the same eternal pot of gruel from a communal earthenware bowl, with coarse, dense rye and barley bread in their hand. This sharp difference in diet is not merely an expression of wealth. In the medieval view, people of different social ranks were thought to be born with different constitutions. Nobles and the rich were believed to have more delicate, refined bodies, capable of digesting only fine foods like white bread, poultry, and wine. Peasants and workers, by contrast, were held to have coarser, tougher bodies, suited only to rough fare like dark bread, vegetable pottage, and ale. If a peasant were to eat a nobleman's food, his body would supposedly be unable to bear it, and he would fall ill. Absurd as this sounds, the theory was widely accepted at the time and became one of the natural laws by which social hierarchy was upheld. And yet, despite the noise and the simplicity of the food, you are surprised to find that people follow a fairly strict code of table manners. Before eating, several people take turns washing their hands at a basin in the corner. During the meal, they are careful not to return food they have touched to the communal dish. Before drinking from a shared cup, each person wipes his mouth clean with bread or a sleeve. These details strongly refute a common stereotype that medieval people were uniformly filthy. In fact, the whole notion of the dirty Middle Ages is to a great extent a Victorian misreading and exaggeration. Medieval people were not indifferent to cleanliness. They simply had different ideas and methods. They commonly wore linen undergarments. Linen absorbed sweat, endured wear, and could be washed much more easily and frequently than woolen outer garment. Even the poorest generally had at least one or two changes of underclothes. They also bathed in rivers, lakes, or the public bathhouses of towns. Public baths were once very popular and served as important social spaces. People soaked there while discussing business, playing games, and gossiping, much as people gather in cafes today. In some castles, however, the room where nobles kept their valuable clothing was often built directly above the privy. This was not because they did not mind the smell, quite the opposite. It was an ingenious anti-vermin measure, the strong ammonia rising from the waste pit below that sharp, acrid odor acted as a natural insecticide, driving away and killing fleas and lice on the garments. So if a great lady put on a gown with a faint, shall we say, distinctive smell, that might not be body odor at all, but a form of deluxe pest treatment. That said, scholarly opinion on medieval hygiene is not entirely settled. One long-running controversy concerns the so-called Great Unwashed myth. The traditional view holds that medieval people, especially in Christian Europe, despised bathing for religious reasons, believing bodily cleanliness to be associated with lust and pride, and therefore bathed only once or twice a year. The main evidence for this comes from certain religious texts that praise saints who gloried in uncleanliness as a form of devotion. More recent archaeological discoveries and studies of secular documents, however, suggest that ordinary people's hygiene was considerably better than previously imagined. Another group of scholars argues that the European fear of bathing was not a general medieval phenomenon at all, but emerged only after the Black Death, when people wrongly believed bathing opened the pores of the skin and made it easier for deadly miasma to enter the body. So were medieval people clean, or afraid of bathing? That depends on which century you ask about, which class of people, and whether they had just lived through an unprecedented plague. The afternoon sunlight grows languid, and the inn's uproar gradually subsides. The guests, fed and watered, gather in small groups by the hearth and settle into idle talk. This is the clearinghouse of information, rumor, and superstition, and internet of the analog age. You hear a stable hand instructing a newcomer. He says that if a horse sweats profusely at night and wakes exhausted, despite not having traveled far, then it must have been ridden by a witch. There is, he says, an evil witch who slips into stables at night, steals horses to use as mounts, rides them through the sky until dawn, and returns them only at daybreak. The only cure is to hang a stone with a hole in it, or a horseshoe, on the stable door. Of course, this is nonsense, but it reveals how people explain phenomena they could not understand. A horse's mysterious nighttime illness to them could only be caused by supernatural forces. Then the subject shifts to spices at the table. William, the widely traveled wool merchant, is holding forth animatedly before a circle of entranced locals about the origin of pepper. Black pepper, he says, is not just the fruit of some ordinary tree. It grows in the forests of the distant east, and beneath every pepper tree poisonous serpents coil to guard it. The only way to gather pepper is to set the forest on fire and drive the snakes away. The peppercorns are black because they have been smoked by the flames. This story is also false, of course, but it circulated widely in medieval Europe. Why did such legends arise? Because spices were expensive and mysterious. To a European peasant, the East might as well have been another planet. A tale full of hardship, danger, and marvel not only explained why pepper was black, more importantly, it justified its outrageously high price. It was a classic piece of consumer psychology. It made people feel that such treasure, so difficult to obtain, was worth the cost. The conversations range over everything, from the love affairs and fortunes of the local lord to rumors of dragons in some nearby forest. An old man just returned from pilgrimage to Santiago in Spain is telling stories of what he saw on the road. In that age, religious pilgrimage was one of the very few legitimate reasons an ordinary person could travel long distances. These pilgrims were like moving routers, carrying stories, news, and disease from place to place. You sit quietly listening, feeling as though you are browsing an ancient forum full of headlines and unverified reports. In the inn, all this information converges, ferments, and is then carried farther onward by new travelers. Together, these people construct a worldview woven from fact, imagination, fear, and longing. The network of that world is made up of countless inns, like the White Hart, connected by countless merchants like William. Later in the afternoon, another group of guests arrives, and with them the air grows faintly tense. These are members of the town's two chief guilds, the Bakers' Guild and the Butchers' Guild. They have clearly arranged to meet here to discuss some matter. But the moment they see one another, they begin their ritual exchange of abuse. The master of the Bakers' Guild, a plump man dusted all over with flour, says loudly to his fellows, "Mind your purses tonight. Don't let certain people butcher them for you." The master of the Butchers' Guild, a broad man in a leather apron, answers at once without yielding an inch. "Still better than eating the stone loaves some people bake. At least our meat can be chewed." This open, ritualized mockery is part of guild culture in the medieval world. Guilds, mutual aid, and monopoly organizations, made up of craftsmen in the same trade, were the most important social units in urban life. Your occupation defined your identity. Guilds controlled not only production standards, pricing, and sales, but also member welfare, religious activities, and even their own militias. Such intense corporate identity naturally bred fierce rivalry and one-upmanship between guilds. They competed over precedence in civic processions, over better seating in church, and even over whose donated church decorations were more splendid. There is a famous historical anecdote from Dundee in Scotland. The Bakers' Guild, proud of the section of church they had funded, inscribed above it the phrase, "Bread is the staff of life." Not long afterward, the Butchers' Guild retaliated by carving beside it another biblical quotation, "Man shall not live by bread alone." This weaponization of sacred scripture for commercial rivalry is guild competition taken to its absolute peak. The war of words before your eyes is a daily version of the same thing. Their argument ranges over everything, from whose workmanship is superior to who contributes more to the city. It is not merely a private quarrel, but a public performance of guild honor and status. Within the guilds themselves, hierarchy is strict. A craftsman's career usually passes through 3 stages: apprentice, journeyman, and master. As a boy, the apprentice enters a master's household to learn the trade, receiving no wages, only food and lodging. After some years, he finishes his apprenticeship and becomes a journeyman. A journeyman earns wages, but must work under different masters and travel from place to place to improve his skill. Finally, only after accumulating enough experience and capital, and producing a masterpiece accepted by the guild, can he become a master himself, open his own workshop, and take apprentices. You watch these 2 groups, although they refuse to yield an inch in speech. When they finally sit down to serious business, there is the same shrewdness in them all. Just as the bakers and butchers' quarrel begins to die down, and both sides are getting to the point, the inn door opens again. A man in official dress steps in, his expression proud and imperious. The moment he appears, the hall, which had still been somewhat noisy, falls markedly quieter. Even Thomas and Martha look a little tense. The newcomer is the local aleconner, an official appointed by the lord or the town authority. His duty is to inspect every alehouse and inn in the district to ensure that the ale sold is of proper quality and that the price is fair. He is in effect a medieval version of a food and drug inspector. The aleconner plainly enjoys the attention. He walks straight to the bar and points with his chin toward the cask of ale that Martha is selling. Martha does not dare delay. She hastily fills a special small cup and presents it with due respect. The inspector does not drink at once. First he raises the cup to the light and examines the color and clarity. Then he brings his nose to the rim and inhales deeply, his brow tightening slightly, as though sorting out some complex aroma. Only then does he take a careful sip, letting the liquid rest on his tongue for a long moment before swallowing slowly. The entire process is full of ceremony, as though he were tasting not common ale, but the king's own drink. Inspection complete, he clears his throat and declares in a tone that allows no objection: the quality is acceptable. Under the assize of bread and ale, the price must not exceed the lawful rate. Martha and Thomas nod repeatedly in agreement. The office may sound enviable wandering about and drinking for free, but in reality, it was rather an unpopular and thankless job. For one thing, without modern refrigeration, ale quality varied wildly, and it spoiled easily, turning sour. Inspectors were often forced to drink liquids of almost indescribable unpleasantness. For another, since they represented official authority in setting prices and levying fines, they were apt to offend people and become unwelcome figures in the community. So the office often had to be imposed by rotation on local men of standing. A very famous story circulates about aleconers, though it is almost certainly invented: the leather breeches test. According to the tale, an inspector wore a special pair of leather breeches. During the test, he would spill a cup of ale on a bench and sit down in it. Half an hour later, if he rose and the breeches stuck fast to the bench, then the ale was said to contain too much sugar or other additives and was of poor quality. Some versions say precisely the opposite, that the more firmly it stuck, the richer the ale and the better its quality. The story is vivid and entertaining enough that at some tourist sites in Britain today, actors in leather breeches still perform this supposed ancient ritual. But historians have combed through the sources and found no reliable evidence that any such sticky bottom test was ever actually used. It is most likely a folk joke or an exaggerated literary fancy, a perfect example of the gap between popular memory and historical fact. People are always more willing to believe the more dramatic, more visual story, no matter how baseless it may be. You look at the scrupulously serious official before you and imagine him sitting in ale-soaked leather trousers. It is hard not to feel that sometimes legend is more entertaining than history. The inspector's visit is only a brief interlude. Once he leaves, the inn returns to normal. The afternoon stretches on, long and dull. And to pass the time, and perhaps win a little money, a group in the corner begins a fierce gambling session. They are playing the most popular and notorious game of the age, dice. Gambling was a deeply contradictory part of medieval society. On the one hand, church and secular law alike strongly condemned it as a vice leading to corruption, idleness, and the loss of property. On the other hand, it was an extremely common form of entertainment, loved by every rank of society. In barracks and courts, or in places like this tavern, wherever a few idle people gathered, dice and cards were never far away. You edge a little closer to see what they are playing. On the table lie 3 tiny dice, much smaller than the ones we use today. Carved from animal bone or ivory, with very sharp edges and almost perfect cubic form. Players throw them in turn into a wooden bowl, and the combination of points decides victory or defeat. The rules seem simple, depending entirely on luck, but the stakes are not small. In the middle of the table there is already a small pile of copper coins and several silver ones. One bearded guardsman has just lost a round, and slams the dice down on the table in annoyance. Across from him, a lanky man smugly rakes the coins toward himself. At that moment the third guardsman, who has said nothing so far, suddenly reaches out and pins the lanky man's hand to the table. In a low voice he says, "Wait, let me see your dice." The atmosphere freezes. The lanky man's face changes. He tries to pull his hand away, but the other man holds it fast. The bearded guardsman reacts as well, glaring as he rises to his feet. A fight seems about to break out. In the Middle Ages, cheating was treated as a very serious offense, especially in gambling. Laws of the time imagined all sorts of grim punishments for fraudsters. One of the most widely repeated and most chilling appears in some town law codes. If a man was caught using loaded or tampered dice to swindle money, he could be punished by having the cheating die nailed straight through the palm of the hand with which he had cheated. The penalty sounds extraordinarily cruel, but given the small, sharp-edged dimensions of medieval dice, it was technically entirely feasible. Its purpose was not only to inflict agony, but to leave a permanent, indelible mark of shame. From then on, wherever the cheater went, the hole in his palm would proclaim to everyone that he was a swindler not to be trusted. Yet, just as both sides are on the verge of violence, the innkeeper arrives carrying a jug of malt ale. He does not accuse anyone. He simply sets the jug in the middle of the table and says calmly, "Gentlemen, have a drink. Today's ale is on me. Don't ruin the peace over a few coins." His intervention is like a bucket of cold water, quenching the flare of anger. The lanky man accused of cheating takes the chance to pull back his hand and gives a thin smile. The bearded guard sits down again and pours himself a cup. Just like that, the whole disturbance is dissolved by a single free drink. You watch them begin drinking and jesting again, as though nothing had happened. The little bone dice lie quietly on the table, as if whispering their ancient story of luck, greed, and lies. In this age, the majesty of law always seems to find some delicate balance within the world of personal relations. The heaviness of the afternoon is broken by the lively sound of a lute. A man enters the tavern with an instrument slung over his back. His clothes are somewhat worn, but his spirit is high, and he comes in smiling. He greets the innkeeper familiarly, then leaps on to the raised stone platform before the hearth, which is clearly his usual stage. He is this age's jukebox and mobile broadcasting station, a traveling minstrel. At once, the few remaining customers turn toward him. Even the guardsmen who were nearly fighting over dice a moment before set aside their grievance and watch with interest. You might imagine that minstrels sing only heroic epics of King Arthur and Robin Hood, or tender tales of knights and noble ladies in love. Those are indeed part of their repertory, especially when performing for noble patrons. But in a tavern, among ordinary townsfolk, their material is much earthier and much funnier. This minstrel clears his throat, plucks the strings, and launches into a comic song about a foolish knight. The lyrics are coarse and hilarious, telling how the knight mistook a windmill for a giant and then tripped over his own long cloak, sprawling face first in the mud. As he sings, he mugs and capers extravagantly, reducing the hall to laughter. Once the song is done, he moves on to a comic monologue, imitating in a sly, exaggerated tone the speech of some local dignitary, mocking the way the man pedantically counts every grain of wheat in the harvest. This sort of inside joke about local notables immediately strikes home, and the audience laughs so hard they bend double. Then he improvises a little ditty on a recent piece of town gossip. A baker fined for mixing too much sand into his bread. In an age without newspapers, when most people could not read, minstrels were among the most important carriers of news. They went from town to town, spreading political developments, marvels, scandals, and local chatter in forms that were lively and memorable. Finally, he strikes up a brisk drinking song and invites everyone to join the chorus. He sings loudly, "You drink to me, and I drink to you. Raise your cup high in the air." This intensely interactive performance sets the whole tavern alight. People pound the tables for rhythm and sing along at the top of their lungs, scattering the afternoon drowsiness completely. The minstrel's song has barely died away when the tavern door opens once more. This time the man who enters changes the mood again. He is wearing armor, but not the shining, gorgeously engraved knightly plate you might imagine. His is a practical fighting harness of mail and leather, worn and scratched from real use. A longsword hangs at his side. His face bears the tired, guarded look of a professional. He is no great lord. He has no squire, no heraldic banners. He is a hedge knight. You may have heard the term in fantasy novels. It refers to a knight without a lord, without lands, wandering from place to place, and living by his martial skill. He walks to the bar, trades a few copper coins for a large cup of malt ale, then sits down alone in the most inconspicuous corner, propping his sword against the table and drinking in silence. He speaks to no one, yet his mere presence is enough to make the people around him feel a kind of invisible pressure. They instinctively keep a little distance. Their glances toward him mix respect, curiosity, and a trace of fear. In the Middle Ages, not all knights possessed castles and estates. Many, especially younger sons and bastards, had no inheritance to claim and could survive only by carrying their equipment and their courage out into the world. Some searched for what was called knightly glory, roaming in pursuit of adventure and tournaments. Others were more practical, moving from lord to lord and serving whoever would pay them, becoming mercenaries. A word we still use today, freelancer, traces its origins to this world. In medieval Italy, mercenary organizations were common and were called free companies. The basic fighting unit within such a company was a lance, usually consisting of one knight and several retainers. A knight not bound to any fixed lord, free to accept employment where he chose, was literally a freelance. So what kind of man is the silent hedge knight before you? In literature especially, the chivalric romances from the 12th century onward, such men are always painted as noble errant knights, fighting for honor, love, and justice. Reality was probably far harsher and more utilitarian. Most of these armed drifters were closer to hired fighters than heroic wanderers. They entered tournaments to win prize money and expensive horses. They went to war for plunder and a lord's reward. The term hedge knight itself is in fact a modern invention and does not appear in medieval texts. But it captures this type of existence exactly. These men had no fixed home. Often they could only sleep outdoors, under hedges or in the woods, poor and uncertain of the future. They inhabited a blurred space between the romance of the wandering knight and the reality of the mercenary. They may still have kept to certain knightly ideals, protecting the weak, keeping their word, but they also had to survive, which meant selling their martial force as a commodity to the highest bidder. That fact alone reveals a deep contradiction within medieval society. Chivalry, the highest ideal of the age, was already being quietly eroded and commodified by a rising money economy. Loyalty, honor, these invisible values were beginning to acquire explicit prices. You watch the knight finish his drink, rise, nod once to the innkeeper, and walk out again into the unknown road. Where is he going? For whom will he fight? No one knows. He is like a lonely planet that has slipped free of the feudal order's orbit, carving an unpredictable path through a turbulent world by his own strength alone. His very existence is both a challenge to that rigidly hierarchical society and a supplement to it. Toward evening, more and more people drift into the tavern. Local folk finishing the day's work, and newly arrived travelers pack the small space full. A woman who looks like a nearby farmer's wife is speaking anxiously in low tones to an old woman sitting in the shadows near the hearth. The old woman's hair is white, her face deeply lined, but her eyes are strikingly bright. She is no ordinary drinker, from the calm confidence radiating from her. She is very likely what people would call a witch. Witches occupied a very special place in medieval society. They were neither physicians nor priests, yet they played an important role at the local level. They were commonly regarded as keepers of folk wisdom, women who knew how to use herbs, charms, and various mysterious rites to treat illnesses in people and livestock, find lost objects, break malicious curses, and even tell fortunes or arrange matches. The farmer's wife looks almost ready to cry, gesturing as she speaks and pointing outside. She seems likely to be talking about a cow at home or some other livestock animal that has fallen gravely ill. In that world, the value of a single beast might equal half a family's annual income. Official medicine scarcely existed, and prayer to a priest may have seemed too distant or uncertain, so turning to the village witch was often the most immediate and effective option. The old woman listens quietly to the farmer's wife's distress and nods. She rummages in a cloth bag she carries and produces a small sachet sewn from fabric, which she hands over. Then she leans close and murmurs something swiftly into the woman's ear, in a voice only the two of them can hear. You cannot make out the exact words, but from the rhythm and cadence, it seems likely to be some spell mixing Christian prayers with older, more mysterious vocabulary. The farmer's wife receives the little charm as though it were a treasure. She takes several copper coins from her purse and sets them respectfully on the table before the old woman, then leaves with profuse thanks. This tiny transaction perfectly displays how such a woman works. You watch her pocket the money, lift her malt ale, and drink it calmly, as though she has just done something quite ordinary. To her, perhaps it really is, in an age when the boundaries between science and superstition, faith and magic, were still deeply blurred. People used every means they could understand or control to struggle against life's uncertainties, and women like her were among the most trusted figures in that wide gray zone. After supper, the sky outside is fully dark. The innkeeper throws several thick logs onto the hearth, and the flames blaze up, driving away the night chill. Most of the tavern's guests are not yet ready for sleep. Holding their cups, they drift instinctively closer to the fire and form a semicircle. This is the final and most relaxed social hour of the day. The same gifted minstrel from the afternoon is sitting among them now, a little flushed with drink. He is not playing his lute. Instead, he begins to tell stories. In an atmosphere enclosed by firelight and darkness, there is only one type of story that is always guaranteed to please: ghost stories. But medieval ghost stories are fundamentally different from the horror films we watch today. Their purpose is usually not simple stimulation or fright. They carry a strong sense of moral instruction and religious warning. The minstrel lowers his voice, and in a mysterious tone, tells a story about a returning dead man. The protagonist is a wealthy merchant from a neighboring village who has recently died. In life he was miserly and oppressed the poor. After death his soul cannot find peace. So every midnight he climbs from his grave and returns to the mansion where he once lived, making sounds of agony and causing his family sleepless terror. His ghost has not returned to harm them. He is a suffering soul, escaped from purgatory. He has come back to beg his family to have masses said for him in church and to give alms to the poor, so that these good works may wash away the sins of his lifetime and allow him sooner to leave purgatory and enter heaven. This story perfectly expresses the mainstream medieval idea of ghosts. In the Christian theology of the period, after death, a soul went to one of three places: heaven, hell, or purgatory, which lay between them. Purgatory was the place where souls not wicked enough for damnation, but not pure enough for heaven underwent purification and atonement. The souls suffering there might sometimes be allowed to return to the human world and ask their kin for help. Thus, medieval ghosts were usually not malevolent specters, but pitiable sufferers in need of aid. Then he tells another tale. Its heroine is a beautiful queen. After death, her ghost appears before her daughter and a knight. Yet her appearance is horrifying beyond measure. In vivid detail, he describes her as stripped of skin, her bones clotted with earth, her eye sockets deep and glowing like burning coal. Countless snakes and crawling creatures slither across her rotting body with a hissing sound. And yet, hideous as she is, her purpose is still to warn and instruct. By means of her own dreadful fate, she admonishes her daughter, the future queen, to keep to virtue and not surrender to vanity or illicit passion, lest she die and suffer the same end. At the same time, she begs her daughter to pray more for her, to ease the pain she endures in the next world. These stories leave the listeners both terrified and deeply impressed with the central teachings of the Church. Sins committed in life must be paid for after death. Prayers and masses offered for the dead are genuinely effective. Listening to such stories travel through the firelight, and watching the faces around you blends of fear, pity, and devotion. You realize that these tales are invisibly shaping their worldview. They define the boundary between life and death, regulate moral relations between people, and finally place the authority to explain all of it firmly in the hands of the Church. Amid the crackling of the fire, an unseen world becomes as real and tangible as the tavern before your eyes. The ghost stories end, the drink takes hold, people begin, one by one, to prepare for sleep. The tavern's common room transforms yet again from dining hall and storytelling space back into a collective dormitory. Most of the local patrons have already gone home. The inn now prepares for those who need lodging. You follow several merchants up a squeaking wooden staircase to the sleeping quarters on the second floor. What you see may be deeply unsettling if you are used to modern hotel rooms. There is no neat row of separate chambers. Instead, there is one vast shared dormitory. Inside stand several broad wooden bedsteads, topped with thick straw mattresses that smell of hay and dust. Men and women, young and old, strangers from different places, will spend the night packed together on these beds. They do not even take off their outer clothes. They simply lie down dressed as they are. Privacy, in the medieval period, was an extraordinarily luxurious concept, perhaps even a non-existent one. From birth to death, the details of life unfolded under public eyes. Rooms in a home seldom had clear-cut functions. Bedchamber, dining room, sitting room, these often blurred into one another. People were used to eating, sleeping, and even handling highly private matters in the presence of others. In the corner of the room stands a communal chamber pot for everyone's use during the night. You can imagine how invigorating the air in this room will be by the next morning. Of course, a wealthy merchant like William receives special treatment. At the end of the corridor, there is a small door, which Martha unlocks with a large key. Behind it is a little single room, barely large enough for one bed and a small chest. But it offers the most precious luxury of all, a door that can be locked. This is the medieval deluxe suite. You glance through the crack and see that William is not resting at once. He is speaking quietly with a local cloth merchant, and the commodity under discussion is William's own daughter, only 14 years old. They are negotiating a marriage, discussing the size of the dowry and the business advantages the alliance will bring to both families. No one asks what the girl thinks. In that world, for women of the upper ranks, marriage was first and foremost an economic and political transaction. Whether love appeared in it at all was largely a matter of luck. You retreat to the common sleeping hall and watch the others lie down without embarrassment. Soon the room fills with overlapping snores. To us, this disregard for personal space is nearly intolerable. To them, it is simply normal life, lying on this crowded bed, feeling the warmth and breathing of strangers at your side. You are filled with uneasy thought. Such an environment forces you to form the most basic and yet most fragile kind of trust in the people around you. Before you can sleep, you have to judge quickly whether the person beside you is an honest traveler or a potential thief or worse. This constant appraisal of other people's character may well have been one of the survival instincts of the age. You close your eyes and try to ignore everything around you, willing yourself to sleep. This shared bed is like a miniature stage of society, binding together people of different identities and origins and forcing them, in the dark, to confront one another's vulnerability and defenselessness. The final candle flame struggles as it burns, then thins into a wisp of smoke and goes out completely. The inn falls fully into darkness and silence. Thomas the innkeeper performs the last, and most important, tasks of the day. First, he tends the hearth carefully. He does not extinguish the fire altogether. Instead, he banks the still burning embers under a thick layer of ash. This is an ancient fire safety technique. It preserves the fire for rekindling in the morning, while preventing sparks from leaping out during the night and causing a blaze. In an age of predominantly wooden buildings, fire prevention is every household's highest concern. Then he goes to the main door, and with effort, slides into place an enormous bar thicker than his own arm, pushing it from one side of the door into the socket on the other. With a heavy crash, the thick oak door is locked fast. At that moment, the White Hart completes the day's final transformation of identity, from a noisy public commercial space open to the outside world, back into a solid private fortress turned inward. Within it, dozens of sleeping souls are now entrusted to its protection through the long night.